unusual as we would like weather events. It is fair to say that Welsh Government are still assessing the extent of the damage and exactly what is necessary by way of rectification. We have said, and we will repeat our commitment, when Welsh Government comes to us with absolutely watertight figures and explain exactly what they need from us, we are ready to help in whatever way we can.
Christina Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, and his Welsh Government ministers have visited flood victims and already pledged an initial £10 million from the Welsh Government's severely restricted budget after 10 years of Tory cuts. Yet, last month, at short notice, the Treasury took back £200 million from the Welsh Government because of recalculations of Barnett consequentials. The Prime Minister has not bothered to visit flood victims in Wales, but could he at least return this money to the Welsh Government to help clean up the damage?
Mr. Speaker, I do have to say that if I was a business or an individual affected by the events of the last few days, the very last thing that I would be expecting to hear in this House is the politicisation of a very difficult situation. This is why, Mr. Speaker, this is why the conversations I've had and the meetings, face-to-face meetings I've had with Mr. Drakeford, First Minister in Cardiff, have been constructive. He has at no stage made the observations that the Honourable Lady has to me. We have agreed, we have made it absolutely clear that as soon as the damage is assessed, we are ready to assist in whatever, notwithstanding the fact that this is a devolved responsibility, and it is absolutely right that we as a UK government should respect the devolution settlement. And I will just finish by saying that local authority leaders... I will leave it at that point.
HS2 will do next to nothing for North Wales and worse than nothing for South Wales. Yet only 6 miles of HS2 railway line will cost more than the crucial first-of-its-kind tidal lagoon in Swansea, rejected by his Tory government. Now, I'm sure he agrees that low-carbon electricity generated in Wales should power the transport of the future. What will he do to get a Wales-wide tidal lagoon projects back on track?
As the Honourable Lady knows, I think she may have even been at the debate that I hosted in this chamber where we actually discussed this into the early hours of the morning. The idea that Tidal Lagoon has a future in the UK, and in particular Wales, is indisputed. The difficulty we had over the Tidal Lagoon project in Swansea was actually in relation to the company proposal itself. So I hope she can be reassured that it's part of the energy mix, part of the renewable commitment that we've made, that that Tidal Lagoon is still there and still under discussion.
Lisa Roberts.
You'll join me in congratulating Wales Week co-founders Dan Langford and Mark Jordan on once again providing excellent opportunities to celebrate Welsh business and culture in London and 21 other places around the world. And I'm sure the Minister will also agree that his government has a crucial part to play in supporting Welsh businesses by ensuring they're not undermined by future trade negotiations. Will he reassure us that in pursuit of trade agreements with both Trump's America and our nearest trading market, the EU, the government will not trade off Welsh animal welfare and food standards in favour of chlorinated chicken?
I can absolutely offer that guarantee, and it is simply a repeat of the guarantee that's been offered by my honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, and indeed the Prime Minister himself.
Daniel Kavinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot of the strength of the mid-Wales economy is predicated on trade with border towns like mine, Shrewsbury, which is currently very badly flooded. Will he accept that more needs to be done between his department and DEFRA to work together to alleviate the terrible problems of flooding on both sides of our border?
Honourable friend makes a very good point. The answer is yes. The answer to this lies in greater collaboration and cooperation across a wider range of agencies and even those that he's mentioned. I think we are learning some very stark and important lessons from this, and I agree with his assessment.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Speaker.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3 and 4 together. Far from lowering standards, the UK already exceeds the EU minimum requirements in several areas, including on workers' rights and environmental targets. We will continue in this vein with an independent trade policy, and in doing so unleash the enormous potential of the UK and Welsh economies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over 60% of Welsh exports are destined for the EU, dominated by key industries vulnerable to divergence-related trade barriers, agriculture, machinery and transport equipment, to name but two. So instead of actively trying to circumvent the Prime Minister's own withdrawal agreement, why isn't the government pursuing the regulatory alignment that is crucial for Welsh businesses and exporters?
Well, Mr Speaker, we of course voted to leave the European Union, and that meant voting to leave the customs union and voting to leave the single market. And I'm quite surprised at the question from the honourable gentleman, because I would have thought that he would be the first to agree with me that a nation which leaves a union will want full control over its regulatory and trade policy. This is a matter of principle which I would have expected the honourable gentleman and his colleagues to be in full agreement with.
Speaker, I share the Minister's enthusiasm that we can now exceed regulations, better regulations set by the EU. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that the government's agenda is proof that our commitment to maintaining the existing high standards that are independent of EU law, and that it's not only businesses that could benefit from this regulatory divergence?
Well, I fully agree with my right honourable friend, and I think that we will be in agreement that outside of the European Union we are looking forward to exercising the freedom to set some of the highest standards in the world on animal welfare, health and safety and workers' rights, and thus make Britain one of the best places in the world in which to live, work and invest.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tomorrow the government will publish its position on the EU trade negotiations. This is of particular importance to the automotive sector in Wales. And just to give the Minister an example, if there were to be 5% tariffs on import exports and 2.5% on components, it could add £1,000 to the cost of production on a car and put jobs at risk. So will the Minister confirm the government is seeking tariff-free access for the automotive sector of the single market, and that if that is not obtained, the government will have a contingency plan in place to support jobs in this sector in Wales?
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise the importance of the automotive sector to South Wales. And he's correct in saying that the government is seeking a full free trade arrangement that will allow full access towards the European market. And quite clearly, if for any reason at all the European Union don't realise that it's in their interest, given that they export more in the way of cars and automotive parts than we do to them, then clearly, whilst I can't absolutely say what will happen, it will be in the forefront of my mind and the mind of all my colleagues that we will want to support the automotive industry in South Wales.
Donald J. Warden.
Number 5, sir.
Mr Speaker, earlier this week, we announced 2,000 extra weekday seats on cross-country trains between Cardiff and the Midlands. We've already reduced journey times by 40 minutes on the Great Western Main Line between Swansea and London, and connectivity to North Wales will benefit from the introduction of HS2, which will shorten journey times and drive economic growth throughout the region.
I thank my honourable friend for that answer, and as well as rail links, not just the ones he says, but also the offshoots from the Great Western Railway to Guildford and Gatwick, will he agree that to unleash Wales's potential, it would be critical to improve links between the M3 and M4, which the Transport for the South East body has recently recommended?
Mr Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to draw attention to the importance of the road network, and in particular the M4, in terms of increasing economic productivity in Wales. And I very much hope that honourable members on the other side of the House will be aware of the importance of the M4 and perhaps encourage the Welsh Labour government to accept the borrowing that has been made available to them to build the M4 Relief Road in South Wales.
Kevin Brannan.
Mr Speaker, the Western Rail link to Heathrow would really help people travelling from Heathrow to South Wales. It could get passengers from Reading to Heathrow in less than 30 minutes, but progress has been badly delayed. When will the construction work on the line properly begin?
Mr Speaker, I'm unable to say when exactly it will begin, but I can assure the honourable member that it is our policy to make sure it begins, and I fully recognise the importance of those links between Heathrow and Reading, and indeed for the rail network across the whole of Wales, which has will see £1.5 billion spent on it during Control Period 6. And overall, of course, the honourable gentleman will welcome the fact that we are currently making the biggest investment to rail infrastructure in the country since the Victorian times.
Speak to Bill.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a reserved matter and it's currently not government policy. I have no plans to discuss this with the Welsh Government.
Speak to Bill.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, he needs to change his mind. Yeah. Wales has one of the lowest numbers of bank holidays in the whole of Europe. Some countries in Europe have twice the number. What have you got against giving workers in Wales an extra day off?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suppose this was inevitable in a way. But my experience of businesses and residents in Wales is very simple. They have an exciting future. They are keen to get on with the new opportunities which face them. They do not either request nor want extra opportunities to reminisce about the past.
John Speller.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister, Secretary of State. 7. Somebody just answer. Question 7, John Speller.
Question 7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apologies for the novice performance from the front bench. Now is an excellent opportunity for public bodies and government departments such as the MOD and NH to buy British goods, products and services. Projects like the £500 million F-35 repair programme in North Wales and 2 million tonnes of steel needed for HS2 have the potential to level up regions and strengthen the Union.
But the Minister's colleague, just in an answer a few minutes ago, was extolling the importance of the automotive industry to Wales. Yet if you look at Welsh police forces, they are buying very heavily from France and Germany. Given that we've come out of the European Union, shouldn't we be taking that opportunity in those vehicles, but right the way across public procurement, to be supporting British jobs and British workers?
I'm sorry, I can completely agree with the right honourable gentleman, and I think that opportunity is now simpler, given that we've left the European Union, and our job here and our job with Welsh Government is to make sure that those procurement rules absolutely reflect the fantastic products that Wales has to offer.
David Jones.
Mr. Speaker, it's a frequent complaint from Welsh construction and civil engineering firms that EU procurement regulations effectively preclude them from bidding for contracts in Wales. Can my right honourable friend confirm that when we have completed the transitional process, everything possible will be done to ensure that Welsh firms do have the chance to bid for those contracts?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't agree with my right honourable friend more. That's one of the great benefits of leaving the European Union.
No. Jessica Morden.
Mr. Speaker, if we want to maximise the benefits of HS2 for Wales, which needs around 3 million tonnes of steel and new high-speed trains, will the Secretary of State lobby the DfT to procure Welsh steel and UK steel and trains from CAF in Newport for the project?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that will definitely be an objective of the UK Government. As the Honourable Lady knows, we take the future of the steel industry in Wales extremely seriously, and I want to make sure that every opportunity that industry has to contribute to UK infrastructure projects is taken.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crickhowell in my constituency was badly affected by last week's floods. We have a lot of small businesses struggling to get back on their feet. As well as public bodies, will the Minister join me in urging all consumers to buy British and buy local?
Yeah. I know the Honourable Lady's constituency was particularly hard hit by recent weather events, and I think her recognition of that is to be commended. And I also completely agree that everything we need to do as a UK government, I keep making this point, in collaboration with our colleagues in Cardiff, will deliver the sort of result that she's looking for.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, we know that for every £1 spent with a small or medium-sized enterprise, 63 pence is re-spent in the local area, compared to some 40 pence in every £1 spent with a larger chain or business. So what steps will the government take to enable public bodies in Wales to buy more local goods, products and services in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Part of the problem in the past has been the restrictions imposed on us because of our relationship with Europe. Now those terms will be changed. It will free up the opportunity for UK Government and Welsh Government to make sure that procurement rules are changed in order to unpick the problems that he's referred to.
Ben Miller.
Question 8, Mr. Speaker.
Mr Speaker, I've already held constructive discussions with Welsh Government ministers on various issues, including city and regional growth deals, which have the potential to create jobs and economic growth in Wales and strengthen cross-border working to benefit both sides of the border.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many of the residents of Aberconwy and indeed across North Wales rely on good road and rail links along the North Wales coast. Does the Minister recognise the importance of that east-west axis and the connections it offers into England for contact with their families, public services work, and dare I say it, even the crew hub as part of HS2?
Mr Speaker, we certainly recognise the importance of those east-west links both in North Wales and in South Wales, and we will be recognising that through the improvements to the rail and road infrastructure and also through the growth deals. I recently had a chance to see cross-border working in action when Dŵr Cymru were taking water in from English counties in order to ensure that the fresh water continued to run in Monmouth after the floods. And I pay great tribute to them, but I can assure the honourable gentleman that we will recognise the importance and benefits of cross-border working because we are a unionist party.
Chris Evans.
As the Secretary of State will know, Henry VII landed next door to his constituency and grew up in the Minister's constituency, Raglan Castle. He also then gained the crown at Bosworth Field. Has he thought about promoting the history of our modern royal family by creating a Henry VII trail which brought about the Tudor dynasty?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I think that's an excellent and an interesting idea. I know that the honourable gentleman is an expert on sporting history and the contribution that boxing has made in Wales. I hadn't realised he was also interested in Tudor history, and I look forward to discussing that with him outside of this chamber.
Mick Williams.
Mr Speaker, can my honourable friend, I know he recognised the east-west links between North and South Wales in England, but also Mid-Wales, the Cambrian line, Shrewsbury to Aberystwyth line needs a signal upgrade. Will my honourable friend convene a meeting with myself and interested parties?
Mr Speaker, it is always a pleasure to meet with the honourable member for Montgomeryshire. He's done a fantastic job of lobbying for better east-west links in his own constituency, and I shall look forward to hear what he has to say. No doubt the Treasury and Department for Transport will also take a keen interest in that.
Wales took the brunt of the storm last week. Hundreds of people in my constituency lost absolutely everything because they have to make a choice between buying food or paying the insurance bill, and they are completely uninsured. RCT Council alone, just one local authority, is going to have a bill of £30 million. What's the point of a United Kingdom if the United Kingdom will not stand by Wales financially when we really need it?
Mr Speaker, as my honourable friend has already said, there have been meetings between himself and the First Minister. At the moment, there's no way of knowing exactly what the costs of those floods are going to be, and I know that the Chief Executive of Monmouthshire wasn't able to tell me, except that it will, of course, run into millions of pounds. We've already moved to ensure that people who receive compensation will not see any impact on benefits. We absolutely stand with Wales, but as the honourable gentleman will appreciate, it would be impossible for us to go marching into Wales and tell the Welsh Government what to do in what is a devolved area. We stand ready. We stand ready to support. We stand ready to support the Welsh Government in any way, but they need to come forward with a set of costs and also to explain exactly how that money will be spent.
Virginia Crosby.
Good night, Mr Speaker.
I'm proud that this government has recently announced that victims of rape and sexual assault will be helped by a 50% funding boost for specialist support services. This will provide additional funding for the vital services offered at 6 rape support centres across Wales.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome the government announcement, which will go some way to ensuring that more people receive the support and advice that they need to recover. I'm also pleased to hear that 2 of the support centres which will benefit from this funding are both in North Wales. In November last year, the Wales Audit Office reported that victims and survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence are being let down by inconsistent, complex and short-term service in Wales. Does my right honourable friend agree that we need to be working towards a Wales where no one is turned away?
Can I reassure my honourable friend that an absolutely shared ambition and intention of UK government, and can I also commend her for bringing this to the House's attention? There are few more important issues facing us at the moment.
Gareth David.
Mr. Speaker, last year thousands of cases of revenge porn were brought forward to the police in Wales, and only a handful of cases went to court because victims don't have the advantage of anonymity and have got to prove malicious intent. Will he ensure he has discussions with the relevant minister on the forthcoming Internet Harm Bill, so women in particular who are subjected to internet porn, basically pornography being thrown out onto the internet without consent, is sorted out properly?
I can absolutely offer that guarantee.
Alan Cairns.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Speaker. I was fortunate enough to visit St Athan last week, where I met my right honourable friend and military personnel. My officials have been working closely with MOD and Welsh Government officials to secure the future of bases in Wales, and they are making good progress with St Athan.
MOD St Athan has been designated a key element of the defence estate across the United Kingdom, but the Welsh Government are refusing our armed forces ongoing use of their existing site. Will the Secretary of State press the First Minister of the importance not only of the obvious economic case that they bring to the community, but the role that they will play in the defence of our nation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can absolutely offer that guarantee as well. I could go a little bit further than that and actually say that the blockage between MOD and Welsh Government has started to loosen. There does seem to be some progress, and I very much hope that we can achieve the objectives that he wants, which is a substantial military footprint at St Athan.
Stephen Doherty.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State for Wales is due to meet with the Secretary of State for Transport in the coming weeks, where they will discuss how we can build upon the new superfast rail transport service between South Wales and London and the improved connectivity HS2 will bring to North Wales.
Mr. Speaker, of course I'm talking about South Wales, but I'm sure the Minister will welcome the support that the Welsh Labour Government is giving to the St Mellons Parkway project in the east of Cardiff. Will he, in the discussions with the Secretary of State for Transport, ensure that as many cross-border services can stop from GWR, but also potentially competitors?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is making a very important point. I'd be very happy to discuss this with him outside, but I can absolutely assure him of the commitment to rail infrastructure in South Wales as well as in North Wales, which is why we spent an extra £1.5 billion during this control period and laid on thousands of extra seats between London and South Wales.
You've got to speed up. Secretary of State.
I've written to the relevant DWP Minister, and I know that he has plans to meet with local MPs and to discuss assessment centres and access in the region. The Government will support Capita to ensure that they find a suitable long-term site in North Wales.
The Disability Centre moved to Hill without consultation is now back in my constituency in Bangor, housed temporarily in a museum. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that that is an apt location for the Government's disability benefit system as well?
I do agree, and I've taken very seriously the observations that the honourable gentleman has made. It hasn't been satisfactory in part, but there is now some movement, I hope, in a positive direction.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Philip Dunn.
Question number one, sir.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to join me in extending our condolences to the families and friends of those who sadly lost their lives as a result of Storm Ciara and Storm Dennis. I know we would also like to thank all those who are providing support to tackle the impact of these storms, including the Environment Agency, local authorities, our emergency services and our armed forces. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Philip Dunn.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to associate myself with the thanks from the Prime Minister to all those helping in the aftermath of Storm Dennis. It's brought record high water levels. Record high water levels in the rivers Severn and Trent, and over 100 properties in my constituency have been flooded, bringing misery to those affected. The Severn in Bridgnorth, as we speak, has just breached its banks. Will the Prime Minister use his influence in the budget and later this year in the comprehensive spending review to increase infrastructure spending on flood defences for communities at risk, and as part of his determination in this year of COP26 to show global leadership taking action on climate change, adaptation and mitigation?
Indeed I can, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend. And I can say that we have been ensuring that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government is able to extend the bail-win scheme where appropriate. And I can also tell my right honourable friends that, of course, we are investing massively in flood defences. £2.6 billion has already gone in. And as he knows, we are pledged to commit another £4 billion to defend this country against flooding.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts are with those suffering across the world from the coronavirus, and I want to send a message of praise to medical and emergency staff all over the world for what they're doing to try and stop the spread of this disease. And I hope that public health services in Britain will get the resources they need. And there is an urgent question on this after Prime Minister's question time today. Thousands of people across the country are also still struggling with the devastating impact of the floods. I want to pay tribute to the work of the Environment Agency, the Scottish and Welsh governments, council staff, fire service who are helping local residents, and the huge numbers of community volunteers who have pitched in to help their neighbours. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Conservative leader of Derbyshire County Council that he's turned his back on the people affected by the floods?
Mr. Speaker, since the flooding began, this government has been working flat out night and day to ensure that the people in this country get the support that they need, activating the bail-win scheme, making sure that business gets the recovery relief that they need, the business rate relief, and, as I told the House just now, putting £2.6 billion now into flood defences and £4 billion more to come.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, you can't give local authorities the clear message you support them and then turn your back on them. Not my words. Conservative council leader said that. When I visited Pontypridd last week, I saw at first hand the damage and destruction that these floods have caused to people's lives, homes and businesses. But the Prime Minister was silent, sulking in his Grace and Favour mansion at Chevening. After 2 weeks of flooding, Mr. Speaker, there are now even memes being produced not asking where's Wally, saying where's Boris. When is the government going to stop hiding and show people that he actually cares, or is he too busy going about some other business? Maybe if he's too busy, he could send his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. I'm sure he'd be very well received in all the flooded areas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the response the government has mounted over the last few days, and we convened the National Flood Response Centre on the 14th, and since that event, since the flooding began, there has been a constant stream of ministerial activity led by my right honourable friends, the Secretary of State for the Environment, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and never forget that in spite of the flooding, and no one should underestimate the anguish that flooding causes, and of course it's an absolute shock to the households that are affected, but it is thanks to the measures that this government has put in that 200,000 households have been protected from flooding, and we don't hear that from the honourable member.
During the election campaign, I wrote to the Prime Minister demanding that Cobra be called to deal with the floods at that time. He very reluctantly agreed with that and eventually did call a meeting of Cobra. The situation now is even worse across the country than it was then. No Cobra has been called, or is he just pretending to care when he doesn't really care at all because there's no votes on the line at this moment?
Mr. Speaker, as he knows perfectly well, there have been a stream of ministerial meetings since the flooding began. The National Flood Response Centre was convened on February the 14th, and I have been directing things, as he perfectly knows. Cobra is a reference to Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. It is not the only room in which meetings can take place, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the issue is very serious for people around the country whose homes are being flooded. They need help and support. They don't need trite answers like that from their Prime Minister. Time and again, communities and lives are being put at risk, and the government simply refuses to acknowledge the scale of the problem. Does he agree with his honourable friend, the member for Shipley, who said the government has done precious little to stop the floods happening again?
Mr. Speaker, let me repeat for the benefit of the right honourable gentleman that this government has a fantastic record of investing in flood defences and will continue to do so. And the reason we can do so, the reason we've been able to commit £2.6 billion to flood defences and we're able to pledge another £4 billion, Mr. Speaker, is because this government is running a strong and successful and robust economy which he would ruin.
Jeremy Corbyn!
If that is the case, Mr. Speaker, why then is the government investing less than half of the amount of money the Environment Agency of England says is necessary to improve flood defences across the country? They say £5.6 billion is needed. So far as I'm aware, the government is investing less than half of that. Many areas in the households that I've visited, and you know what? I've learnt a lot from visiting victims of floods. The Prime Minister should try it one day. They told me they can't actually afford the insurance on their homes as the costs have skyrocketed. Recent studies have shown that 20,000 homes are not protected by the government's insurance scheme, are also not protected by flood defences. That's 20,000 homes with no insurance and in danger of being flooded imminently. Isn't it time the Prime Minister found a very urgent solution to this problem? Just imagine what it's like to live in a home that's in danger of being flooded, you can't get it insured, and if you own it, you can't sell it or can't move. You are totally stuck. They are looking for the government to help them out at their time of crisis.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he is perfectly right in the sense that there are particular problems to do with insurance that I think anybody who's visited a flood-affected household will know. Flood Ray, on the other hand, has provided cover for over 164,000 households since 2018 and 2019. We are now looking, since last December's events, we are now looking at what we can do to protect households that do not have proper insurance. But he also knows that there are measures in place to ensure that householders get £500 and £5,000 to compensate themselves from the worst damage that flooding can do. And that is cash that we can put in thanks to the investments that we have made in flood defences, which, believe me, would be beyond the capacities of any government led by a Corbyn, by a government led by the right honourable member.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The Welsh Government have done their best to step up to the crisis despite the underfunding from Westminster. The Prime Minister was keen to pose for cameras when there's a crisis on during the election, but he often goes AWOL. He was late to respond to the London riots because he was on holiday. He was on a private island when the Iranian general was assassinated. And last week, he was with his head in the sands in a mansion in Kent. The MP for Calder Valley, another of his colleagues, said it's not good enough. How can the country trust a Prime Minister, a part-time Prime Minister? Last night, schmoozing Tory party donors at a very expensive black-tie ball, instead of getting out there and supporting the people who are suffering because of the floods. This government needs to step up to the plate and invest in defences and ensure there is real insurance for people whose homes are being ruined by these floods as we speak.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman asked what this government has been doing in the last few days. Well, let me tell you, not only have we been investing massively in flood defences and compensating those who suffered from flooding, but we've been stopping the early release of terrorists. We've restored the nurses' bursary. We're beginning work on 40 new hospitals. We're recruiting 20,000 more police officers. And we can do that, Mr. Speaker, because we have a strong and dynamic economy with employment at record highs, unemployment down to the lowest levels since the early 70s, wages going up, home ownership up. And what are they doing, Mr. Speaker? They're still deciding. Listen to them jabbering away, Mr. Speaker. Jabbering away.
I think we'll have a little bit more silence on the second Prime Minister.
Quite right, Mr. Speaker. Jabbering away because they still can't decide whether or not they want to be in the European Union. And the hottest topic of debate in the Labour Party is what job should the right honourable gentleman have in the shadow cabinet after the leadership election. Mr. Speaker, they are engaging themselves in narcissistic debate about the Labour Party. We are getting getting on in delivering on the people's priorities.
The Prime Minister will be aware of the concern in settled rural communities such as those in North East Hertfordshire because of intentional, unauthorised development of travellers' sites. This leads to large numbers of lorries, large numbers of caravans coming onto land where there's no planning permission, and then subsequently the ignoring of enforcement when the local authority tries to intervene. The government has said that it will bring forward measures to try and tackle these planning issues. Will the Prime Minister put his authority behind this and get it sorted out?
Mr. Speaker, I take that issue very seriously, and I thank my right honourable friend for raising it. We're giving local authorities more powers to reject intentional, unauthorised development, and we will be consulting on the details of those proposals in a forthcoming white paper, and I hope that he will contribute to those consultations.
In Blackfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, we learned that 40% of small businesses in Scotland employ more than one EU national. Mr. Speaker, immigration is crucial for Scotland's economy. So it's no wonder that the Scottish Government's proposals for a Scottish visa system have been universally welcomed by businesses and charities alike. Even the Scottish Tories think it's a good idea. The Prime Minister rejected these proposals within a few short hours. Does he now admit this was a mistake?
Mr. Speaker, it was not only I who rejected the proposal, but also, of course, the Migration Advisory Committee, and that is because we are bringing forward a very sensible proposal which the people of this country have long desired, whereby we take back control of our immigration system with a points-based system, and we will ensure, because the honourable gentleman has an important concerns to raise, we will ensure that everywhere in this country, all businesses, all agricultural sectors, all the fishing communities in this country will be able to access the labour and the workforce that they need under our points-based system. But what will be the height of insanity, Mr. Speaker, would be to proceed with the SNP's solution of a border at Berwick between England and Scotland.
Once again, the Prime Minister shows he is utterly delusional. Let's look at the reality. Scottish Care has said that the Prime Minister's damaging immigration plans shuts the door on enabling people to be cared for in their own home. The General Secretary of the GMB Union says the plans could genuinely tip businesses over the edge. Scotland's National Farmers Union have said their evidence has been disregarded by the UK Government. And the Scottish Tourism Alliance say their plans will have devastating impact for Scotland's workforce. We know, Mr. Speaker, that senior figures in the UK Government have said what the Scottish Parliament decides, and I quote, doesn't matter one jot. If the Prime Minister thinks the Scottish Parliament doesn't matter, the Scottish businesses matter, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, Scottish businesses matter, and the way to do well by Scottish businesses would not be to tax them with the highest tax rates in the UK. It would be to run a sound economy in Scotland. It would be to have an educational system that doesn't leave Scottish children lagging behind through no fault of their own. Mr. Speaker, this government will get on and deliver a working immigration system for the whole of this country, and I may say respectfully to the right honourable gentleman who shouts at me from a sedentary position that once again he would be better off getting on with delivering for the people of Scotland rather than continuing with his ceaseless and vain quest to break up the United Kingdom, because he will not succeed.
Laura Trott.
Is delivering for the people. So I'm sure the Prime Minister shares my concerns about the delay in the delivery of the Maidstone East line, which runs through my constituency and others. Will the Prime Minister intervene to ensure there are no further delays in this vital railway line?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for rightly raising the issue of of rail connections with Mason East and the City, and I can tell her that in addition to the 48 billion that we are putting into the railways, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of Transport, has just indicated to me that those connections are his highest priority.
Docket to use. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Graham was born with cerebral palsy, unable to talk, walk or feed himself. He brought joy and love to all who knew him. And last week, one of the Prime Minister's advisers resigned when a basic check of their internet history revealed that they had promoted eugenicist policies, the sort that would have ended my brother Graham Docherty's life before it began. So can I ask the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to advise the House and every disabled person in this island why Andrew Zabisky remained at the heart of his government and was not removed from their position immediately when their abhorrent views became apparent?
Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear that I certainly don't share those views, and nor are they the views of anybody in this government, and that individual no longer works for the government.
Second Batte.
Does the Prime Minister agree that through the establishment of the Office for Environmental Protection, which will hold this government and future governments to their environmental commitments, it is the Conservatives who are driving the environmental agenda? And will he join me in commending the Conservative-led Solihull Borough Council for their commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030?
Mr. Speaker, it of course brings me great joy to congratulate Solihull Borough Council on their path-breaking leadership. Of course, they are following in the footsteps of the national government and Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead, who led the way in setting a carbon zero target by 2050. This Conservative government is going to leave our country, our environment, in a better state for the next generation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a pregnant constituent with her due date in the next couple of weeks. She is currently on universal credit, and after deductions, including an advance, she is left with a grand sum of £111 a month to feed herself, to heat her home and to prepare for her child. Now, I know the Prime Minister will likely want more details about this case and will be happy to help, but I want to ask him, in principle, as the Prime Minister, does he think that £111 a month is enough for anyone to live on?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm of course very happy indeed to look at the case and to do whatever we can to help with the individual case. But I must say to her that in the round, universal credit has helped and is helping 200,000 people into work. There is an estimated 1 million disabled households who will get around £100 more per month as a result of universal credit. And I'm proud to stand by a record of helping people into work and off welfare. But as I said to her before, I'm more than happy to look at the case. And the answer to her question in a word is no.
Ben Bradley.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the people of Mansfield, who, like many millions across the country, previously voted Labour but now put their faith in a Conservative government to deliver, are not in fact traitors, as they've been branded by members of the party opposite this week, but in fact this government and members on this side of the House respect these hard-working people and communities, we respect their choices and we will deliver for them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on the vituperation that is meted out by the party opposite, but what I will say is that all voters should be treated with respect and with humility. And I congratulate him on the hard work he's doing for the people of Mansfield. £10 million for West Nottinghamshire College, £20 million for road improvements, £5 million for proactive lung health screenings, and up to £50 million in a town new deal and future high streets funding. In my view, the people of Mansfield are well served by my honourable friend.
Kate Osborne.
Mr. Speaker, like many other sub-postmasters, my constituent, Chris Head, was victim to the Post Office Horizon IT system scandal. Yes. These errors have resulted in bankruptcy, imprisonment and even suicides. Will the Prime Minister today assure Chris and others that he will commit to launching an independent inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I am indeed aware of the scandal to which she alludes and the disaster that has befallen many post office workers, and I'm happy, and I've met some of them myself. I'm happy to commit to getting to the bottom of the matter in the way that she recommends.
Brilliant, Kate.
If you live in one of the rural villages in my constituency, it can take a whole day to travel to and from a hospital appointment because bus services are so few and far between. As a fellow bus enthusiast, will my right honourable friend assure me that some of the £5 billion in the pipeline for bus services will go towards improving routes in Penistone and Stocksbridge?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the vital importance of buses and their transformative power. But as for the detail about what will happen in Penistone and Stockbridge, she will have to await the upcoming national bus strategy, which will be along very shortly.
Sajid Javid. Mr. Speaker, before the last successful climate change talks in 2015 in Paris, I led the British preparations, including delegations of the 3 preceding UN climate talks. Global action on climate change only happens when the host nation engages with the world's largest nations in advance at the highest political level. So as the host of the 2020 climate talks, will the Prime Minister today publicly commit himself to meeting President Xi of China, Prime Minister Modi of India and US President Trump to secure for the Glasgow talks global action on the climate emergency?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I can tell him and tell the House that, of course, I've already engaged just last week with President Xi of China, repeatedly with President Modi of India, Prime Minister Modi of India, and also, of course, already on this subject with President Trump. But there will be an intensifying drumbeat of activity in the run-up to Glasgow.
Thank you. No doubt remember with the same fondness the conversations that we had when he was outlining his plan for global Britain. I welcome very much what he has been saying about the defence review that is now planned and his priority on having a strategy-first, foreign policy-led review. Will he please make a statement to this House so that the views of this House can be heard, bringing together trade, aid, defence, foreign affairs and, of course, defence?
I can, of course, give that commitment when the moment is right, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister has a laundry list of climate promises. No doubt he'll read them out shortly, but he can't escape the fact that net zero won't be reached until 2099 on current rate of progress, not the 2050 he claims, let alone the 2030 we probably need. Even JP Morgan says human life as we know it is under threat. He can't be a climate denier, can he? So when will he take climate crisis seriously?
Mr. Speaker, these aren't promises, these are what we've already done. And it's thanks to Conservative action on climate change that we've reduced CO2 output by 43% on 1990 levels since 2010. And the economy has grown by 73%. 99% of all the solar panels installed in this country have happened under this Conservative government. And let me tell you that in 1990 this country was 70% dependent on coal. Today it's 3%, and they'd reopen the coal mines, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. John Downey, the IRA terrorist responsible for the Hyde Park bombing in 1982, which killed 11 soldiers, received a letter of comfort from the government, and his trial collapsed. Corporal Dennis Hutchins received a letter in 1974 saying he would not be prosecuted in connection with the shooting incident which took place in Northern Ireland. He was then investigated again in 2011 and told there was no further ground for taking any action. Does the Prime Minister accept that if Dennis Hutchins goes to trial on the 9th of March, all the assurances, all the promises, the manifesto commitment will amount to nothing more than meaningless, empty platitudes?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's to rectify matters such as the one to which he draws the House's attention, that this government is finally bringing in a law to prevent the vexatious prosecution of our hard-working, hard-serving veterans when no new evidence has been produced.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday's press showed the widening health inequalities between the richest and the poorest. The money promised to Epsom St Helier Trust could have addressed that issue in my area. But instead, the NHS are removing services from the poorest areas and sending them to leafy Belmont with the longest life expectancy. St Helier Hospital will become a glorified walk-in centre. No A&E, no maternity unit, no children's services, 62% of beds gone. Will the Prime Minister reassure me that he will look at this to show that much doesn't have to always get more?
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the 14 new hospitals that we are building, part of the 33.9 billion initial investment that we're making, in the record investment that we're making into the NHS, I can tell her that Epsom and St Helier Hospitals, University Hospitals NHS Trust, will receive £500 million to redevelop its estate and world-class facilities on that site.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister promise to resist in all circumstances the sellout of our fishing communities so that we can ensure that on the 1st of January next year we take back control of our fishing waters and become an independent coastal state once again?
I will indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I hope her words were listened to very carefully by the members of the Scottish Nationalist Party, because it is they who would hand back control of our fishing to Brussels.
Donald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are families and businesses in my constituency who have been left devastated after Storm Dennis tore through their properties. The strength of our union is based on sharing resources at people's time of need. But so far, not a penny announced by the United Kingdom government will benefit Wales, where the cost of repair is going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds. The Prime Minister talks the talk on the union, but will he today commit a cast-iron guarantee that he will provide the major new funding that Wales needs to recover from these floods?
Well, the honourable gentleman is quite right to raise the issue of flooding in Wales, where of course it is a devolved matter, but nonetheless this government is committed to working flat out with the Welsh devolved administration to ensure that everybody gets the flood relief that they need, and that cash, yes, of course, it certainly will be passported through.
Michael Longgate.
Dudley is to receive £25 million investment via the government's Towns Fund. Thank you. We are looking to use this money to secure a university campus near the town centre. Will the Prime Minister lend his support for this scheme in order to level up and generate greater opportunity for Dudley people and the greater Black Country?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to champion Dudley in the Black Country, and I will certainly look at what I can do to be there in person. Is that what he's asking for? I'll do. Be careful what you wish for. To be there in person to support what sounds like an excellent scheme.
David Linden.
As we've seen today, religious intolerance in India is on the rise, be it with the anti-Muslim citizenship laws or Christians whose prayer meetings are disturbed and then subject to brutal beatings. So will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me and a representative from Christian Solidarity Worldwide to look more closely at this issue and ensure that India upholds the freedom of religion and belief?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises an absolutely crucial issue which I'm particularly concerned to defend and advance myself, and that's why I was very pleased to appoint my honourable friend, the member for Gillingham and Rainham, to be our special envoy for freedom and religious belief, and to protect those of a Christian faith in India and indeed around the world. I'm more than happy to meet the honourable gentleman.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know of the appalling misery that the residents of Shrewsbury are facing with the deluge of floods that have affected our town. I'm very pleased that the Minister for Flooding, our honourable friend, the member for Taunton Deane, is visiting Shrewsbury tomorrow. She's doing an excellent job. But will the Prime Minister ensure that the proposals put forward to government for a more holistic approach to managing the River Severn are looked upon seriously, because Shrewsbury cannot continue to suffer this level of economic damage with repeated floods?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the concerns of the people of Shrewsbury in the way that he does, and everybody can see how serious the problem is now with the Severn. And I will ensure that the Department of the Environment working with the Environment Agency, takes the necessary steps.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Michael Marmot's damning findings outline the devastating impact that a decade of this government's cuts has had on a constituency like mine in Gateshead. Since 2010, Gateshead Council's spending power has been cut in real terms by around 50%, or £160 million per year. Our local safety net has been removed. What does the Prime Minister intend to do as a matter of urgency to reduce the stark and worsening health and life expectancy inequality between North and South, rich and poor, so that people in the poorest areas of my constituency can expect to live as healthily and as long as those in the most affluent areas of his constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually I have the highest respect for Professor Marmot and did a lot of work with him in London, and where we did a huge amount to reduce health inequalities and inequalities in life expectancy. But there is more to be done, and I do not deny it. And that is why this government is absolutely committed to uniting and levelling up across our country, with the biggest ever investments in the NHS, with massive investments in education and, of course, in early years provision. And I make absolutely no apology for the campaign for levelling up that we are about to undertake. And I just repeat my point to the House. There is only one way that we can fund this, only one way we can achieve this, and that is to have a strong and dynamic economy. And I would rather have a country and a society where we believed in hope and opportunity and the importance of work rather than welfare and benefits. And that is our approach.
Order. I have granted leave to the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove to make a personal statement following his resignation from government. I remind the House that there can be no debate arising from such statements nor interventions. I call Sajid Javid, the Right Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has been 8 years since I last stood to speak as a backbencher, and it is a privilege to do so again. When I left these benches, it was to become a minister in the Treasury, and it seems apt that I went back to whence I came, the circle of life. I'm very proud to represent the good people of Bromsgrove, and I will, of course, continue to do so. I will also continue to champion the causes that I believe in most, albeit from outside the government. I confess that I had hoped to have a little longer to make a difference from the inside. So, with thanks for your permission to speak, Mr. Speaker, I thought it would be appropriate to briefly explain first to the House why I felt that I had to resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all those colleagues in this chamber and beyond for their messages of thanks in the last 2 weeks. And I want to take the opportunity too to thank my family for their love and patience over the last few years. Yeah. I came into politics, Mr. Speaker, to give something back to the country that has given me so much. And while I do not intend this to be my last chapter in public life, in whichever form that may take, I'm immensely grateful for the trust and the support of colleagues in all the roles that I have had. After first holding 2 ministerial positions within the Treasury and then returning as Chancellor, I've had the huge privilege of running 4 departments. Each taught me more than the last, and it shaped my understanding of government. I can look back and say to myself, very sincerely, that I have never once made a decision, or indeed given advice on a decision, that I did not believe was in the national interest. You see, Britain's democracy and economy are strong because of its institutions and its people. Conservatives especially believe that no particular person or even a government has a monopoly on the best ideas. It is through these checks and balances of credible institutions, be it the Treasury, the Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility, indeed this House, that we arrive at sensible decisions that are in the national interest. Now, when reflecting on the dynamic between number 10 and number 11, it is natural to look at past relationships. There is no one size that fits. Any model that works or doesn't depends on the personalities that are involved just as much as the processes. It depends on the mutual respect and trust that allows for constructive, creative tension between teams. And it is that creative, that dynamic, that it has always been the case that advisers advise, ministers decide, and ministers decide on their advisers. I couldn't see why the Treasury, with the vital role that it plays, should be the exception to that. A Chancellor, like all Cabinet Ministers, has to be able to give candid advice to a Prime Minister, so he is speaking truth to power. I believe that the arrangement proposed would significantly inhibit that, and it would not have been in the national interest. So while I was grateful for the continued trust of the Prime Minister in wanting to reappoint me, I'm afraid that these were conditions that I could not accept in good conscience. Now, I don't intend to dwell further on all the details and the personalities. The comings and goings, if you will. Much of... Now, Mr. Speaker, much of this commentary was just gossip and distraction, and now it is in the past. I very much hope that the new Chancellor will be given the space to do his job without fear or favour. And I know this, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend for Richmond is more than capable of rising to the challenge. He worked for me as a local government minister and as Chief Secretary, and I could not have asked for a better working relationship. Indeed, I had lobbied the PM for him to be given the role of Chief Secretary and to keep it at the recent reshuffle, but I didn't get my way on that one. So, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has won a huge mandate to transform our country, and already he is off to a great start, ending the parliamentary paralysis, defeating the radical left, getting Brexit done, a points-based immigration system, and an infrastructure revolution. Now, our party, our government, has a huge opportunity and a responsibility ahead. We need a resolute focus on long-term outcomes and delivery, not short-term headlines. The Treasury as an institution, as an economic ministry, should be the engine that drives this new agenda. And since last summer, it has done just that, from planning properly for Brexit to bringing in a generational step change in infrastructure investment, from rewriting the Green Book to better favour our regions, to long-term thinking on human capital and designing the blueprint for levelling up across our country. I'm incredibly proud of the scale and the speed of the work that has already been done. But the Treasury must also be allowed to play its role as a finance ministry with the strength and credibility that it requires. You see, I'm a proud, low-tax Conservative, and I always will be. Already, our tax burden is the highest it's been in 50 years. It is fair to say that not everyone at the centre of government always feels the pressure to balance the books. It was ever thus. But the Treasury has a job to do. It is the only tax-cutting ministry. Every other department has an inbuilt incentive to seek and to spend ever more money. Not that I did that when I ran departments, of course. but trade-offs have to be made somewhere. I see my right honourable friend for Maidenhead is agreeing with that. And at a time when we need to do much more to level up across generations, it would not be right to pass the bill for our day-to-day consumption to our children and grandchildren. And unlike the US, we don't have the fiscal flexibility that comes with a reserve currency. So that's why the fiscal rules that we are elected on are critical. To govern is to choose, and these rules crystallise the choices that are required. To keep spending under control, to keep taxes low, to root out waste, and to pass that litmus test that was rightly set in stone in our manifesto of debt being lower at the end of the Parliament. Now, while I'm, of course, disappointed not to be finishing what I started, I look to the future not with apprehension, but with great optimism. We on these benches we have a shot at achieving nothing less than wholesale renewal for our economy, our society, and for our country. A chance to give everyone an opportunity to live up to their full potential, and wherever they live and whatever their background, a chance to put people, place, and social justice at the heart of a more human capitalism, and to bring our country together as one nation. Mr. Speaker, I know that this is a shared vision, and I firmly believe that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has the tenacity, the energy, and the skill to see it through. I want to leave the House in no doubt that he has my full confidence and the government my full support to get it done.
Just sit down. Point of order, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, would it be in order for me to thank my right honourable friend for the grace with which he has just spoken, for his immense service to this country in several departments, and to remind my right honourable friend that he has friends and admirers on all sides of this House of Commons.
As the Prime Minister knows, he is correct. It's not a point of order, but I'm sure it will be on the record. No, I'm not going to take any more points of orders because they're coming. Because I want to get this statement underway. Points of order will follow. We now come to ministerial statement. Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Secretary of State Matt Hancock.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to update the House on COVID-19 coronavirus. Mr. Speaker, as of this morning, 7,132 people in the UK have been tested for the virus. So far, 13 people in the UK have tested positive, of whom 8 now have been discharged from hospital. We expect more cases here. As planned, 115 people left supported isolation at Kents Hill Park in Milton Keynes on the 23rd of February. All tested negative for COVID-19. On Saturday, 32 people from the Diamond Princess cruise ship were repatriated and taken to Arrow Park, where they'll remain in supported isolation, and 4 of those have tested positive and been transferred to specialist centres. British tourists are currently being quarantined in a hotel in Tenerife, and the Foreign Office is in contact with them. Mr. Speaker, we have a clear 4-part plan to respond to the outbreak of this disease: contain, delay, research and mitigate. We're taking all necessary measures to minimise the risks to the public. We've put in place enhanced monitoring measures at UK airports, and health information is available at all international airports, ports and international train stations. We've established a supported isolation facility at Heathrow to cater for international passengers who are tested and to maximise infection control and free up NHS resources. The NHS is testing a very large number of people who travel back from affected countries, the vast majority of whom test negative. In the past few days, we've published guidance for schools, for employers, first responders, for social care and the travel industry on how to handle suspected cases. If anyone has been in contact with a suspected case in a childcare or an educational setting, no special measures are required while test results are awaited. There is no need to close the school or send other students or staff home. Once the results arrive, those who test negative will be advised individually about returning to education. In most cases, closure of the childcare or education setting will be unnecessary, but this will be a local decision based on various factors, including professional advice. Schools should be guided by the advice on the gov.uk website and contact their regional schools commissioner in case of queries. I can tell the House that in the coming days we will roll out a wider public information campaign. While the government and the NHS have plans in place for all eventualities, everyone can play their part. To reiterate, Our advice is for everyone to take sensible precautions like using tissues and washing hands more. Yesterday we updated our advice to returning travellers from northern Italy, defined as anywhere north of but not including Pisa and Florence, as well as Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar. Those returning from Iran, from the lockdown areas of northern Italy, and the special care zone in South Korea should self-isolate and call NHS 111 even if they have no symptoms. We're working closely with the World Health Organization, the G7 and the wider international community to ensure that we're ready for all eventualities. We're coordinating research efforts with international partners, and our approach has at all times been guided by the Chief Medical Officer, working on the basis of the best possible scientific evidence. The public can be assured that we have a clear plan to contain, delay, research and mitigate, and that we're working methodologically through each step to keep the public safe. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jonathan Ashworth.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance notice of his announcement and for sight of his statement. And all our thoughts, again, must be with those who have been diagnosed with coronavirus COVID-19 in the UK and across Europe. And again, we reiterate our support and put on record our support, our thanks to all NHS staff and public health staff and the Chief Medical Officer as well for the leadership he is showing. The World Health Organization has warned that countries are, quote, simply not ready for a pandemic, and there has now been significant spread of the virus across the European continent, Italy in particular, but other cases have been identified in Austria, Croatia and Switzerland. This is clearly now very, very serious. Yesterday there did appear to be a little bit of discrepancy, if I may say so, between the travel advice from the CEO and himself. Can you just clarify for the House what exactly is the travel advice for those travelling or seeking to travel to northern Italy? I think that would be welcome. We welcome his remarks or his plans for Heathrow. Could he just explain to the House why that facility is only proposed for Heathrow and why it's not going to be, similar facilities will not be in place at other major airports, particularly the bigger airports like Manchester and so on. He mentions the situation in Tenerife. We're all obviously very concerned about the situation in Tenerife. Could you just offer a little bit more detail on what advice and support is being offered to British nationals at this hotel? I note what he says about schools and entirely understand what he says about schools, but we do have several schools in England and Northern Ireland shut completely at the moment for a deep clean after students and teachers have returned from skiing trips. I understand his point about schools should check the relevant websites and get local advice, but is he expecting any advice to be sent to schools from the Department for Education? And if schools have to start shutting, is the government looking at putting in place arrangements for alternative schooling provision for those affected? Now, turning to the NHS more generally, could you just update the House on how many specialist beds are available across the NHS and how many ECMO beds are available across the NHS? We know, of course, that the NHS is under intense pressure at this time of year. Indeed, today the BBC is running with a story about people waiting on trolleys in hospital corridors and so on. The Nuffield Trust has warned that there is, quote, little in the tank to cope with coronavirus. At the same time, Public Health England has announced that tests for coronavirus are being increased to include people displaying flu-like symptoms at 11 hospitals and 100 GP surgeries across the UK. Could he tell us, are community trusts and CCGs going to fund this extra work related to coronavirus from their existing baselines, or is he making any representations to the Treasury for additional emergency NHS revenue resources in the coming weeks? And with respect to the capital facility announced in his previous statement, could he just update the House on how much has been drawn from that capital facility for hospitals to develop the specialist pods to quarantine patients? But can I reiterate, on behalf of the opposition, we want to work constructively with the government on this issue. We are broadly supportive of the steps he is taking, and I hope he understands we are trying to be constructive in the questions we are asking, and we would continue to thank all NHS staff for the work that they are doing at this difficult time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with the honourable gentleman in reiterating our thanks to all the NHS staff, Public Health England staff, and others who've been working so hard on this. And I also want to express my thanks both to him and, in fact, to every single member of this House with whom I and my ministers and department have had dealings on this issue, in each and every case, everybody has taken a responsible and proportionate approach. This is not a political matter, this is a matter of keeping the public safe, and everybody has played their part in this House too. There are, of course, plans in place in case of this virus becoming pandemic, but it is not yet certain that it'll become pandemic, and so we are still in the phase of the plan which is contain, where we aim to contain the virus both abroad and here at home to prevent it from becoming a pandemic, whilst of course ensuring that plans are in place should that happen. On the specific point of the advice on travel to Italy, all but essential travel is not recommended to the quarantined areas of northern Italy. And the advice of those returning from northern Italy is very clear, which is that if you're coming back from the quarantined areas, then please self-isolate. And if you're coming back from the whole of northern Italy, then please self-isolate if you have symptoms. I hope that advice is very clear, and it's also available on the website. He asked the question about Heathrow. We've expanded the availability of supported isolation facilities because just having Arrow Park and the Milton Keynes facility available is not appropriate for individual travellers who we think need to be quarantined. At the moment, those numbers are low, which is why we only need one facility. We've chosen one near Heathrow because that's simply the point of the biggest throughput. But of course, we don't rule out rolling that out more broadly if we think it's necessary. He asked about advice to schools. We have repeatedly issued advice to schools, which goes from the Department for Education. I'm glad to see the Minister for Schools in his place. And we issued revised advice to schools this morning. Our goal here is to try to keep schools open wherever we can, so long as that protects the public. In fact, our wider goal is to have the minimum disruption, social and economic, and indeed to the NHS, subject to keeping the public safe. And the message that we do not have a policy of blanket closures of schools is a really important one, and that unless there is specific professional advice, or unless there is, and certainly until there is a positive test, then schools should stay open, should follow the advice on the gov.uk website, and if they have queries, should contact their regional schools commissioner. He asked also about the availability of testing. We now have testing sites at all A&E facilities as far as we know, across England. But we're also planning to introduce home testing, and some of this has started already, so that people don't have to go to the pod in front of A&E, which have been put there to ensure people don't go actually into A&E, where they might infect others. But home testing is the safest place to be tested, because then you don't have to go anywhere, and that will allow us to roll out testing to a much larger number of people as well. Finally, he asked about funding available. Funding is available from the Treasury. We've used it so far for capital funding, but this obviously remains an issue we keep under review.
Greg Clark, and I'm expecting to run this to around 1:30. Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask my right honourable friend whether the rollout of diagnostic testing facilities to 11 laboratories in the UK has now been completed? And does he have plans to extend that coverage if there is a need to, if there were to be a wider outbreak?
There has been a rollout to a wider number of laboratories, and we also have plans that we're working through at the moment for wider commercial diagnostic testing, and we're working with around a dozen private companies to ensure that we get rollout to using private diagnostic testing companies, not least because there is globally a search for essentially a by-the-side-of-the-bed testing capability. At the moment, all testing is done in labs, which means you have to take the swab, take it to the lab, and then get the result. Where we want to get to is that you can have testing capabilities, the bit of kit, sitting by the bedside of the patient so that tests can be done and run on site. There is a global search for that capability. It does not yet exist. We're putting funding and support into making it happen, and I very much hope that we can come to that solution quite soon.
Dr. Philippa Whitman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Worldwide, obviously, we're looking at about 80,000 cases, which is 10 times the number that we saw with SARS, suggesting this is a very infectious condition. So will the UK government liaise with international partners to ensure accurate reporting? Because it will be critical to map the spread of this, and there will be a danger some countries underreport because they will be afraid of economic impacts. Is any consideration being given to using actually thermal detection technology at Heathrow so that actually that could be spread across more sites? Because we can no longer just think it's only people coming from a few countries. Really, people can be following different routes, and therefore almost everyone would need to be screened who's coming in. Obviously, preventing or containing the initial spread, as the Secretary of State spoke about, there's only a very small window of opportunity where that is possible. And one of my concerns I raised the last time is not self-isolating asymptomatic people, particularly when we're aware that the case that spread to others in the UK was someone who was not significantly symptomatic. We don't know what the prodromal phase is, and therefore people could be spreading this condition when we don't know. So the advice really needs to be clear. Does he recognise the confusion there is now that if you're coming back from certain parts of North Italy, you must self-isolate even if asymptomatic. But if you're coming from China, you don't need to self-isolate if you're asymptomatic. And I think that's really causing confusion, and we may end up behind the curve when, if containment is going to work, you have to be ahead of the curve. Obviously, self-isolating does not count as illness. So will the government send a clear message to employers so that those who are advised to self-isolate will still be paid or receive sickness cover? Because otherwise there will be people who will feel they must go to work because they simply can't afford to have no income from, for 2 weeks. Now, the Secretary of State suggested he wouldn't go to wider northern Italy, and the Chief Medical Officer suggested people with health conditions shouldn't. But travel insurance only kicks in if the Foreign and Commonwealth Office gives a very clear guidance. So will that guidance be changed to actually make it that people shouldn't be travelling to wider northern Italy and indeed other areas, so that people are again not disadvantaged by not having travel insurance if they choose not to put themselves and indeed all of us at risk of spread?
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right about concerns about underreporting, especially in some countries. I'm afraid that I don't recognise some of her clinical observations about this, and I don't recognise the idea that we should change travel advice between China and Italy. What we should do is base travel advice on the clinical evidence based on the experts. And I'm very happy to ensure that she gets a full briefing from the medical experts to ensure that she gets the clinical points right. On thermal detection, rather like stopping the flights, this is against clinical advice. The clinical advice is not to undertake thermal detecting because you get a lot of false positives. And indeed, the only country in Europe that undertook thermal detection at the border that I know of was Italy, and it has now been the scene of the largest outbreak. Finally, a very important point about people in work and who go to self-isolation. Self-isolation on medical advice is considered sickness for employment purposes. It's a very important message for employers and for those who can go home and self-isolate as if they were sick because it's for medical reasons.
Drew Mercer.
Mercifully, nobody has yet died in this country of coronavirus, but every year 600 people die of seasonal flu. In the phase to which he has referred, is he redoubling our efforts to ensure that particularly the elderly and vulnerable are vaccinated against seasonal flu and therefore perhaps mitigating against pressures on our National Health Service in the event that coronavirus becomes more of a problem here and makes demands particularly on intensive care beds?
He's absolutely right, and the vaccination rate was, I think, a record level this year. And is very important. And of course, the simple measures that everybody can take, like washing your hands and making sure you use tissues, they protect you against the flu as well as from coronavirus.
Angela Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The four people who are welcome to Arrow Park developed symptoms subsequent to coming to this country, despite being extensively tested before they were allowed to fly. Does this cause the Secretary of State any worry? And can he say a little bit about what this might mean for whether people are infectious before they're symptomatic?
It's my job to worry about all these things, and the answer is that that sequence of events confirms to me the importance of having quarantined people. And I know that there were some concerns about quarantine, but I think that it showed that we were dead right to quarantine people because it turned out that they became positive or tested positive during the quarantine. I just want, Mr. Speaker, to put on our record the thanks to the Honourable Lady and to everybody in her constituency and the Wirral as well, more broadly, who have risen to this challenge.
Caroline Johnson. No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if I could ask my right honourable friend a bit more about the travel advice. I've had constituents write to me who are planning holidays to countries that are currently affected, for which the travel advice is currently to isolate on return if symptomatic. Some of these people don't want to go on those holidays because they're genuinely frightened, understandably, but they can't reclaim the money because the travel advice is not saying that they can't go. So, and if they do go, that when they come back, they then have to isolate, which essentially lengthens the holidays and can give them significant difficulties with their responsibilities. Can you advise what my constituents should do in that circumstance and what liaisons will you have with the Foreign Office on that basis?
Well, the decisions on the precise travel advice for each country is, of course, a decision for the Foreign Office, but I can tell her that all of these considerations are taken into account, and we have to base decisions on this on the best possible science and clinical advice.
Ms. Kendall.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State what assessment the government has made of the potential economic consequences of the spread of the coronavirus globally and within Europe and the UK? He will know that Northern Italy, for example, is in lockdown, that we have seen other countries that have had much greater spread of the disease actually providing some sort of economic stimulus because whole areas are shutting down. We are not there at all in the UK, but has he spoken and discussed this issue with the Treasury, because the potential impact on growth and the nervousness of financial markets about this is very real?
Well, she's absolutely right to raise this, and of course I've talked to the Treasury and the new Chancellor of the Exchequer about this question. Of course, this is another important consideration, that overreaction has its costs too, economic and social. And so we have to keep the public safe, but we also need to act in a way that's proportionate, and that does come into our consideration. My primary goal is to keep the public safe. Of course it is, but you've also got to take into account the impact of the other impacts as well. So a reason, for instance, that schools should stay open, there isn't a blanket ban unless there's specific reasons for them not to, as I set out in the statement, is because closing a school doesn't only have an impact on the education of the children, but it also has a wider social and economic impact too.
Brian.
The Secretary of State for, I think, the very responsible way that he's handling this very serious situation, and he is clearly working very, very closely, as his predecessors did and I did when I worked with him, with Professor Chris Whitty, the CMO, and following the evidence, that has to be right. He said last time he did a statement in this House that he felt that it would get worse before it get better, and I think he's been borne out by events in that. What level of personal responsibility, though, would the Secretary of State think that individuals and employers specifically have? Because there are alternatives to travel, especially when it comes to business travel. There's technological solutions. What level of personal responsibility should people take to help the contain part of this?
I think this is a very wise question. My honourable friend is absolutely right to ask it, because while, of course, the NHS has a very important role to play in responding to this crisis, and of course, PHE is leading the public health response and doing it brilliantly, and Professor Chris Whitty, as Chief Medical Officer, has done an amazing job over the past 2 months on this and is one of the finest epidemiologists in the world. The truth is that everybody has a role to play, right from the simple things of washing your hands all the way through to responding in a sensible and proportionate way. I think it's important to dwell on that.
Madam Moran.
I'd like to join with others in thanking in advance NHS staff for the work that they're going to have to do to both contain and deal with this. But would he join me in commending the work of Professor Gilbert and others at the Jenner Institute, who are working tirelessly to develop the vaccine? As he said in his statement, the NHS 111 service is now in effect the frontline service. We may have received, all of us, text messages from our GP surgeries saying to contact them first. Could I ask the Secretary of State, what are we doing to ensure they are properly staffed, properly trained? And just very finally, Mr. Speaker, this is very important, would he join me in condemning those who are hurling racist abuse at some British Asians, both in Oxford and elsewhere, because of worry that you can racially profile those who may have this, and that is not acceptable, and we need to all calm down.
I abhor any racist attacks that have that people might say have resulted from this. It doesn't matter what the circumstances. Racism does not help. It hinders any response. I can assure her that 111 staff have got the support that they need, and we have backup plans, and that is all part of the plan that we've got. 111 is responding brilliantly. I mean, thank goodness we've got 111. It's only a couple of years old, and it's absolutely delivering in these circumstances, because everybody in the country knows that if they worry about themselves having coronavirus, everybody should know what to do, which is to call 111.
Greg McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really do pay credit to the Secretary of State at this very difficult time, and his statement has been very measured. He mentions 4 means: containment, delay, research and mitigation. Obviously, containment and delay comes with it serious economic and social disruption. We're seeing that in the markets at the moment. I would say mitigation is what we must be doing the most. We're seeing a very strange virus here with a very long period between infection and symptoms. The number of interactions people are making will be simply innumerable during that perhaps 2-week, maybe even longer period, which makes the thermal testing, which is often the first way forwards, a difficult one to actually analyse. So I think I'd like to see the Secretary of State look more seriously with the CMO and other international experts at whether this is simply another flu virus that is difficult, problematic, but recoverable from.
Thank you. I will certainly do that. I would just, and I agree with him on the importance of mitigation. I mean, the mitigation strand is really about should this become a full-scale pandemic, and the very significant impact that would have on the country, including, of course, on the NHS. I would also just pick him up on the delay strand of this work is that even if we don't succeed in containing this, we want to delay its arrival so that it doesn't all arrive in one big peak, but arrives over time, so that we can better cope with it. That's what the delay strand is all about. And of course, the contain strand is about trying to stop that from happening at all.
Alex Shovel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the House knows, I was in self-isolation last week because Harry Horton of ITV alerted me to the fact that there'd been a confirmed case at the UK Bus Summit, which I attended. When I rang 111, the advice was, if I'd been in contact with the person who had coronavirus, I should self-isolate. If I hadn't, I wouldn't. But no agency could confirm or deny whether I'd been in contact or not. So more work on tracking needs to be done. Will the Secretary of State consider, for instance, like the Chinese government, developing a tracking app to help people in that situation?
Well, I'm very happy, subject to consent, to look at that. But I would also say that the way that contact tracing works is that once the positive case is identified, you go out from the positive case rather than going from the wider population, including attendees at the bus conference, and then going in. So it was, the contact tracing was undertaken in the correct way, and indeed the majority of cases that we found here in the UK have been found through the proactive contact tracing undertaken by Public Health England, which commends them on their approach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for that statement. Obviously, it's something that affects all of our constituencies. So will he confirm that he will continue to provide further information to the House as the situation develops and more information becomes available to us, so we can keep our constituents' minds at rest that everything that can be done is being?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, I'll keep the House and the wider public updated. That's an incredibly important part of this. And of course, for any colleague, my door and the door of the Minister for Public Health is always open to answer any questions.
Mr. Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask what steps the government is taking in partnership with tech companies to battle fake news on coronavirus?
Well, this is a very important subject, and in fact something I've been working on in the last 24 hours to ensure that tech companies, social media companies, Google and others make sure that they promote the right answers to questions about coronavirus. Most of the social media companies who we've been in contact with them, they have behaved in an exemplary fashion in making sure that information like from the NHS gets promoted on their site.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend for his statement today. Following on from the last question, it is clear that everybody has heard the advice to self-isolate. But exactly what that may mean for certain groups, like one person in a family who may be symptomatic, and groups of university students, etc., exactly what self-isolation means is difficult. So can I urge on him to pursue a public health initiative?
Yes, we updated the advice on exactly what self-isolation means earlier this week. It does, for instance, mean going home, and if other people live with you at home, trying to keep out of contact with them. It means obviously not going on public transport, leaving the house as little as possible, and trying to get other people to do things like collect groceries. But it does mean within a house where there's lots of people living, trying to stay away from others living in that house. I appreciate that that is practically challenging and difficult, especially, as a father of three small children, I get it. But that is the goal of self-isolation.
Lockhart.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. Can he answer what communication his department is having with the devolved administrations concerning precautions? Schools, particularly one in my constituency, is in a state of flux, not knowing how to manage it, and what he is doing with the ports in Belfast to try and ensure that precautions are put in place. You also mentioned financial support. Can he outline if there will be additional support for Northern Ireland if this disease comes to Northern Ireland?
Well, public health crises like this are a UK-wide reserved matter, but we've had excellent working with all of the devolves, in particular the new administration in Belfast. They join our weekly Cobras. We'll have a Cobra this afternoon at which they will be present. Of course, some of the matters, especially in the mitigate strand of work, are of course devolved, like schools and healthcare. We work very hard on that, and I'm sure that we'll ensure that any financial consequentials are appropriately dealt with too.
To Julian Lewis.
Someone starts feeling unwell on their journey home, what should they do when they arrive at the airport? Presumably they ought to report to someone before travelling on public transport.
Yes, they should make themselves known to the public health presence at the port, and of course they can call 111 from mobiles too.
Hilary Benn.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Further to the answer that the Secretary of State gave a moment ago to the honourable member for Wimbledon, we've heard what he said about the person who is self-isolating, keeping away from other family members. What is the advice to the other family members about whether they should go about their normal business, go to work, go to school if they're children, in those circumstances?
Other family members who are asymptomatic should go about their normal business in the normal way. It's those who have tested positively who should self-isolate.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health Secretary is absolutely right that containment of COVID-19 is very important. So in that vein, will he keep under review isolation facilities being made available at London Gatwick Airport, which of course has many flights to and from both Asia and Europe?
Yes, of course. It would be the obvious next step. I won't confirm that. We don't need it yet, but that's all part of the plan.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Irish authorities have already advised the Irish Rugby Football Union to call off the Six Nations game against Italy, which indeed obviously affects the North as it's an all-island team as well. And England are due to play Italy in the Six Nations in a few weeks' time. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with his colleagues in DCMS and with the sporting authorities about advising what to do in relation to the Six Nations Championships and other sporting events?
Well, obviously DCMS are involved in the cross-government decision-making on these things. Our goal is to minimise social disruption, of which this is an important part for any rugby fan, subject to keeping the public safe. These are difficult balances to strike sometimes, and I'll be discussing it with the new Secretary of State at DCMS.
Bretley.
Thank my right honourable friend for what he has said, particularly in relation to schools. He may be aware that a school in my constituency has closed as a precautionary measure after students returned from northern Italy. Could I ask that my right honourable friend contact both myself and the school to reassure the parents and the staff members?
So I'd be very happy to discuss with her the specific case, either me or the Minister. I am looking into this specific example. There are a small number of schools that have taken that step. I understand why they do, and it's of course a decision for the head taking into account local factors. But we're putting in place, through the regional schools commissioners, the structures to be able to ensure that every school can get the advice that they need. But in the first instance, every school should go to the website because there's a huge amount of advice on that.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What action is the Minister taking to make sure that the support and communication being given is adequate and clear to British nationals currently quarantined in the hotel in Tenerife, and also to their families who will rightly be worried?
It's a very important question. We're getting as much information as we possibly can through the Foreign Office to those who are in Tenerife, and as I announced in the statement, we'll shortly be strengthening our domestic communications programme to ensure that people have all the information they need.
Ben Everett.
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased that yesterday evening one of the health ministers took me aside and said how well the whole of Milton Keynes had reacted to hosting a quarantine centre, and he was indeed right. Of course, the professionals in the NHS and clinical and managerial were fantastic, as were the officers in the council. But Mr. Speaker, I think we should recognise that the whole health team, the Secretary of State, his ministers, his advisers, his officers, and indeed parliamentarians on any bench in this House have reacted incredibly well to this. And so can the Secretary of State reassure us that this is part of the UK being the best prepared or very well prepared in the world to deal with this kind of outbreak?
Mr. Speaker, he's right about Milton Keynes, and the people of Milton Keynes have done exactly the right thing, and I'd add to his list Milton Keynes Hospital, which has done a brilliant job. I'd also add to his list that he was complimenting more broadly the media, who have largely, in very large part, responded in an incredibly responsible way to what is a very big story. And I would just say this, that we have, of course, detailed operational plans for dealing with this, including if it gets much worse. And those plans have been worked on, are being updated for all the information that we get. But part of the plan is about the behaviour that people undertake and how people respond in this House, in this country. And thus far, we've seen an exemplary response, and I very much hope that that continues.
Many wedding dresses in this country are designed in this country but made in China. And wedding dress companies in the UK, including in my own constituency, have found it really difficult because the factories have been closed in China, and they're now suffering. Having married many women in my time, when I was a vicar, I'm aware that this is very time sensitive. And there's a real danger to many of these businesses that they're going to suffer enormous financial loss, let alone to the families. So I just wonder whether he could chase up replies from ministers in other departments to make sure that there's some kind of financial support to these companies.
Well, he raises an important point, and through the medium of the wedding dress makes actually a much broader point, which is that a huge amount of things are made in China, and this is true also of drugs and pharmaceuticals, and right across the board, especially clothing. And this virus and the impact on China will have an impact here through those supply chain problems. I'm working with the Treasury on the appropriate response to that, and containing the virus will obviously have health benefits, but it'll have economic benefits too.
Tracy Craig.
Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman for Cardiff West sort of nicked my question in terms of the number of sporting events that have been cancelled around the world, which I know the Secretary of State will be aware of. But could he be clear on what advice he is giving to those who do host the events and constituents of those who do attend these events to prevent the spread of coronavirus? And can he also confirm that 111 call handlers, contrary to rumours on the internet, are not advising people to go and see their GP?
Well, the fact is on 111, people should call 111 if they're concerned. They should not attend A&E, and they shouldn't go to their GP unless 111 has correctly told them to do that. And 111 are highly trained. There are GPs at the other end of the line to make sure that people get the best advice. It is the place to go to.
Peter Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having experienced the outbreak in my hometown of Brighton and Hove, I would like to commend the work of his department, his officials and public health officials across the country. Particularly, I'd like to say thanks to his ministerial colleague, the member for Bury St Edmunds, who personally went really beyond the call of duty to keep me and colleagues informed every step of the way. Whereas I am convinced the strategy that was unfolded in our city was the correct one, what wasn't done quite well enough was explaining why the strategy was unfolded and explaining to residents why that strategy was chosen. So we had the situation where people who came into contact with people with coronavirus were contacted in a very proactive way, but people who were in the same space but were concerned had no information at all. Is this something that will get better going forward?
Yes, he's right to praise my colleague. It's a pity, Mr. Speaker, you didn't call him earlier because she just left the chamber. He's right that we're constantly learning. Communication in this area is always a challenge because you've got to get some quite technical information over to a very large number of people in a very short amount of time. We do our very best, but we're constantly learning from what went well and what went badly, and I'd love to hear more from him about how we can improve it for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from my honourable member's question, in your statement you referenced a public information campaign. Can you provide more detail about that and also confirm that it will be ongoing as the situation changes?
Well, that's right. So we have an existing public information campaign to explain to people that the best thing to do is to call 111. We'll be strengthening that and especially trying to persuade people to wash their hands more and to look out for themselves, especially if they have a sneeze, and to try to slow the spread, as well as what to do if you think that you're infected. And getting this information right across to the whole population is incredibly important.
Ian Paisley, would you flag
I welcome the Secretary of State's level-headed, clarion certainty and how he's approached what is a very difficult event, and it does give confidence to many people across the country. That approach. Cambridge House Grammar School in my constituency had to send home pupils yesterday. They appear to have acted absolutely by the book in terms of the advice that was given us. So therefore I welcome the communication between the Department of Health here and the Department of Education and Health in Northern Ireland, and I hope that that continues. With regards to the game to be played on Saturday between Italy and Ireland, many Ulster players and Ulster fans watch that matter very, very closely. His counterpart in the Republic of Ireland, Simon Harris, has said the game should be stopped. The Department of Health here has taken a much more level-headed approach and said they should monitor the situation. The IRFU that will ultimately take the decision don't seem to know what to do. Can the Minister, the Secretary of State from that dispatch box, give clear and clarion advice to the IRFU?
I can confirm that I will ask the Chief Medical Officer to speak to his Republic of Ireland Chief Medical Officer colleague and to make sure that the very best and appropriate clinical advice is given. Rather than me giving it from the dispatch box, I'll ensure that we get the best clinical advice and join up with the Republic.
Speaker, I hear what the Secretary of State's saying about people should go about their ordinary lives if they're not tested positive. But in the situation where parents are self-isolating whilst waiting testing, should their children be going to school until we know the outcome of that test? Because schools being what they are, that's bound to cause some degree of alarm in that school, and shouldn't the children be kept away until such time as the all-clear is given?
Well, I think it's best here that we follow the clinical advice, which is as I set out. One of the good things compared to other similar illnesses about this COVID-19 coronavirus is that it seems much less impactful in terms of symptoms on children. That is good news because, you know, for a flu it's normally the other way round. So that observation underpins the clinical advice, and we need to listen to the scientists.
Paul Girvan.
Thank you, and thank the Minister for the statement to the House. In relation to our airports and our staff that work in the airports, what advice and help has been given to them, as they are the gatekeepers on many occasions?
Add our thanks to the Border Force, who've done a fantastic job in this, and the staff at the international ports, who, through DFT and through the Home Office for Border Force, we're constantly engaged to make sure they get the right information, the right support for staff, and if he has any specific queries, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Dean Russell.
First of all, may I say what a fabulous job I believe the government's done and the Secretary of State in terms of public information. I just wondered whether you'd agree with me that I think it would be very helpful for all the members in the House, given our reach on social media and through surgeries that we do in our constituencies, that we put up posters and that we all across the House put out the information that needs to be broadcast to our constituents together in our tweets and in our own social media, so we have the most reach. Thank you.
I'm very happy to do that, and more broadly, I'm open to ideas for how we can improve the way that we respond to this, including learning from where things haven't gone well. The approach here is to simply try to get the UK response the best it possibly can be. That is my only goal in this, and when there are good ideas like that one, we'll act on them.
Jim Shelton.
Speaker, can I congratulate the Secretary of State on his clear leadership in this matter and for his determined way to deal with the issues. He referred to a number of schools in Northern Ireland, but can I ask this question? Northern Ireland schools are now concerned about their proposed trips planned in advance, paid for and soon to travel. What advice would the Secretary of State give to those schools, not only in Northern Ireland but across the whole of the United Kingdom? Should they travel or not?
The critical thing is to follow the Foreign Office travel advice, which is informed by the evidence, including by the scientists, which is constantly held under review and which is clearly published on their website.
Point forward, Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's time that there are health ministers actually in the chamber, because there have been two important announcements this week in connection with the dangers of smoking. One is an attempt by a tobacco manufacturer to interfere in the development of public health policy. The other is the projection by Cancer Research UK that the government will miss their target for reducing smoking levels to 5% for adults. It will now take a further 7 years to reach this target. Mr. Speaker, are you aware if any minister from the Department of Health is planning on making a statement on this projection and the government's attitude to tobacco companies trying to muscle in on public health policy?
I can assure the honourable gentleman that nobody's been in touch to tell me that any minister is going to make a statement. I think the good news is that the Secretary of State for Health has certainly heard your plea.
Right.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Speaker. You will be aware, Mr. Speaker, of the very serious concerns that have been raised on all sides of the House, including just now in Prime Minister's questions about the appointment of the racist, sexist and eugenics supporter Andrew Sabisky to a senior role at number 10 Downing Street, which the government have yet to answer questions on. I wrote, Mr. Speaker, to the Cabinet Secretary, the Prime Minister and the Minister for the Cabinet Office, asking a series of questions about the nature of his appointment, his vetting and the processes that led to it, but I've yet to receive a reply. So firstly, Mr. Speaker, do you know how I can encourage the government to respond urgently to those concerns, which I think are in the national interest and the interest of the House to know? But secondly, the Prime Minister today laid a written statement about the Security and Defence Review, and it's been alleged to me, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Sabisky was employed to specifically advise on that review. The Prime Minister seemed to suggest we were going to have an oral statement on that soon to come. Could he tell me, has he had any notice of when the Prime Minister intends to come and answer questions, including who is advising on this very important review?
I thank the honourable member for giving me notice of that. What I would say is I'm not responsible for ministers and their answers. What I would say is I think government responses, members had the courtesy of having early replies. What I would say is I'm sure that he knows that if we use the table office, they will use their best endeavours to certainly help. And I certainly know that the honourable member will not give up that easily. So I'm sure that on the benches that will have been heard, and that my advice will be get some replies quickly. Now can I come Bell Riviero Adam?
Speaker. On Monday, the Home Secretary